You bought a war bond once. Or maybe it was your grandfather. 25 bucks for a piece of paper that promised you $50 in 10 years. It felt patriotic. Safe. The government was backing it, after all. But here's the thing nobody bothered to mention at the time. That $50 you'd eventually get, it wouldn't buy nearly as much as the 25 you handed over. You weren't actually loaning them money. You were basically giving them a gift, and somehow they got an entire generation to do it with a smile. Picture this. Your neighbor shows up at your door. He's not trying to sell you anything. Exactly. He's wearing a badge that says 4-Minute Man. Yeah, that was really what they called them. He's got 4 minutes to talk you into buying a Liberty bond. For minutes flat. He's rehearsed this speech, probably given it a dozen times already today. And he's just one of 75,000 guys doing the exact same thing in towns across America. 4 times a day, every single day, for 2 solid years. This wasn't some grassroots fundraising effort. This was psychological warfare aimed at their own people. The pitch went something like this. Your boy is sitting in a trench somewhere in France right now. German artillery is raining down. Machine guns rattling. He needs bullets. He needs supplies. He needs you to do something. But you're standing here in your doorway, comfortable and safe. You're basically a coward unless you step up and buy this bond. Buy it, and suddenly you're a patriot. You're helping win the war. The guy walks off your porch, and you've bought the bond. So has everyone else on your street. Because everybody could see who didn't. The houses without those little flags hanging in the windows. The neighbors without the buttons pinned to their jackets. When 75,000 men are working the neighborhoods, social pressure stops being subtle real fast. Let me break down the actual numbers for you. Liberty bonds in World War I paid you 3.5% interest. Sounds decent, right? Except inflation during the war was running at 17% every year. So you hand over $100 in 1917, and 10 years later you get back $116. Great. Except that money only buys what 70 bucks would have bought back when you first paid in. You just lost 30% of your purchasing power. The government borrowed your money at 3.5% while inflation ate away at 17%. That's not really a loan when you think about it. That's more like a tax dressed up in patriotic clothing. And they managed to sell $46 billion worth of these things. Not millions, we're talking billions. In 1917 money. Now you might be thinking, okay, that was World War I. Desperate times, emergency measures, all that. Watch what happens just 25 years later when they run the same playbook. Same basic strategy, except they learned a few things and got way better at it. It's 1942, and the Treasury Secretary gets everyone together in one room. Hollywood big shots, radio people, advertising executives. We're talking Disney, Warner Brothers, Frank Capra. The absolute best propaganda minds the country had to offer. Their mission was simple but tricky. Sell war bonds to a population that still remembered getting burned the last time around. How do you convince people to make the same lousy financial decision twice? Simple. You don't talk about the money at all. You talk about dead kids instead. The poster campaign kicked off hard. You'd see a mother clutching her child with text reading, "Don't let this happen here." Buy war bonds. Or a house burning down with a family trapped inside. This is the enemy. Bonds are your weapon. A sailor floating face down in oil-slicked water. He gave his life. You loan your money. Notice how they phrased it? Loan, not give loan. It's coming back to you with interest. Guaranteed safe, backed by the government itself. Which was technically true. The government would absolutely pay you back. What they conveniently forgot to mention was what that money would actually be worth when you got it. Series E war bonds turned into the most successful financial product in American history. 85 million Americans bought them. That's 65% of the entire country. Everyone, including kids. They literally sold bonds to school children. 10 cents got you a stamp. Fill up a book with stamps. Trade it for a bond. Schools started competing over who could run the most successful bond drives. Kids pressuring their parents. Parents pressuring the neighbors. The whole social fabric of the country got weaponized for debt financing. And the crazy thing is, it actually worked. They raised $185 billion. That's half of all war spending. Half. Paid for by regular citizens loaning their money at rates that didn't even keep up with inflation. But here's the question nobody seems to ask. Why did they even need the bonds? The government can literally print money whenever it wants. The Federal Reserve exists for exactly this kind of thing. They could have just created the dollars needed for tanks and planes and battleships. And actually, they did that too. Money supply went up 47% during the war. So why also bother selling bonds? Why take money from citizens when you can just make it appear out of thin air? There are two reasons. First, pulling money out of circulation helps control inflation. If your savings are tied up in bonds, you can't go out and buy a new car or fancy appliances. Less demand means more stable prices. Second, and this is the part they definitely don't advertise, shared sacrifice creates buy in. When you personally own war bonds, you're financially invested in winning. You need the war won. You need the government to stay solvent. You'll put up with rationing and restrictions and shortages because your own money is wrapped up in this. You're not just a bystander anymore. You're part of it. Let me paint the picture of how this worked in practice. It's 1943, and there's a factory worker in Detroit pulling down $40 a week. He buys a $10 war bond every single week. That's a quarter of what he makes. He's been told this is temporary. When the war, bonds mature, he gets his money back with interest. 2.9% interest, they tell him. Inflation during the war is actually running at 5% annually. He's losing money every single week, but he has no idea. Nobody's telling him the truth. The newsreels show soldiers storming beaches. The posters show children being saved from destruction. Those 4-minute men are back, now called victory speakers, and the social pressure is absolutely everywhere. All his coworkers are buying bonds. His union is pushing bond drives. His employer has posters plastered all over the factory. Is your payroll savings plan up to at least 10%? 10% minimum. That's what you need to hit just to avoid being noticed, to avoid being judged, to avoid someone asking uncomfortable questions about your loyalty. And here's where it gets really nasty. The bonds don't mature for 10 years. A full decade. You buy in 1943, you get your money back in 1953. Who's going to remember what the interest rate was 10 years later? Who's sitting down to calculate real returns versus inflation? Who even knows what inflation was over that period? The loss is basically invisible, spread out across 10 years. By the time you figure out you got a raw deal, the war's been over for years. The bonds did their job. The system worked exactly as designed. What are you going to do at that point? Demand some kind of inflation adjustment. Now you're unpatriotic. You're ungrateful. Men died on beaches. You lost a couple percentage points annually on your bond investment. Keep your mouth shut, but it actually gets worse. The war ends in 1945. Victory parades, celebration, everything. Bonds start coming due. The first Liberty bonds from World War I are finally getting cashed out after all these years. People start realizing they lost money. Complaints start rolling in. Letters to Congress. The Treasury Department goes into panic mode. Not because they can't pay people back, they definitely can. They're panicking because there's going to be another war eventually, and that war will need bonds too. If word gets out that bonds are a terrible investment, the whole system falls apart. Their solution? Change the rules after the fact. Series E bonds had original terms of 2.9% interest with a 10-year maturity. In 1947, they announced new terms. Interest gets extended, maturity stretched out to 40 years. Some of the redemption penalties get waived. They literally changed the deal after you'd already bought in, made it slightly less awful, and nobody sued. Because trying to sue the government for keeping your money longer is a pretty tough sell when they just finished saving the world from fascism. Jump ahead to 1951. Korean War starts up. Same system, same bonds, same propaganda machine. But something had changed. Television was now a thing, and the Treasury Department had learned a lot from Hollywood over the years. Bond drives transformed into variety shows. Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra. Big celebrities selling bonds on live television. Singing, dancing, telling jokes. Buy a bond. Support the troops. It's the right thing to do. They're not mentioning returns anymore. They're not talking about inflation. They're talking about dead soldiers and communist invasions and doing your patriotic duty. The actual financial transaction just disappears behind this patriotic performance. You're not really buying a bond at that point. You're joining the show. You're part of the act. And everyone's watching to see whether you'll play along. Here's the pattern that emerges when you look at the whole thing. Every American war followed the same playbook. Bonds paying less than inflation. Massive propaganda campaigns. Social pressure deployed in a systematic way. World War I, World War II, Korea, Even Vietnam had bond programs, though they were smaller and way less successful. People were starting to catch on by then. By Vietnam, bond sales dropped off hard. People got suspicious. They started comparing returns. Someone finally did the inflation math. The trick was exposed. And then everything changed. Wars stopped getting funded through bonds sold to citizens, started getting funded through deficit spending and foreign debt instead. China and Japan holding treasury bonds instead of your grandmother. The mechanism shifted. The target changed. But the underlying principle stayed exactly the same. Finance wars with borrowed money. Pay it back with devalued currency. Transfer the real cost from government to population through inflation. Whether the population is directly holding the bonds or just getting hit with inflation, either way, the result is identical. They end up paying. You end up paying. Let me lay out the math really clearly. World War II, 185 billion in bonds sold to Americans. Average interest rate was 2.7%. Inflation during the war period ran at 5.1% annually. Your real return was negative 2.4% per year for 10 years straight. Total real loss works out to 21%. That's the aggregate across everyone holding bonds. 21% of purchasing power just gone, transferred to the government, disguised as patriotic investing, accepted by the population, celebrated in newsreels and propaganda films. Nobody dared call it a tax, but functionally, that's exactly what it was. A hidden tax, an inflation tax. You just got a bond certificate instead of a bill. The final irony in all of this is that the bonds actually worked perfectly as designed. Not for the investors, obviously, for the government. They pulled money out of circulation during a period of wartime inflation. They created political buy-in for continuing the war effort. They distributed war costs across the entire population instead of just hitting taxpayers. They prevented consumer spending that would have created massive shortages. They gave ordinary people something to do, some way to feel like they were contributing, some illusion of control over events. The bonds succeeded brilliantly at every single goal except the one thing they were supposedly about, which was making investors money. But that was never the actual point. The real goal was financing a war without immediate taxation, without creating panic, without having to admit that nobody was going to profit from any of this except defense contractors and the politicians who'd get to claim victory. The bonds were a mechanism for distributing the losses. Shared sacrifice turned into mathematics and sold to the public with flags and images of dead children and celebrity variety shows. You probably think this is just history. You think it ended decades ago. Take a look at your bank account. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded by $4 trillion in 2020. Money supply went up 26% in a single year. Largest peacetime increase in American history. Where did all that money go? Who ended up paying for it? You did. Through inflation. Your savings account. Your paycheck. Your grocery bill. The mechanism is exactly the same as it always was. Just the method changed. No bonds required anymore. Just print the money directly. Let inflation tax everyone automatically. Call it quantitative easing. Call it emergency response. Call it necessary economic stimulus. Just don't call it what it actually is, which is a transfer of purchasing power from the population to the government, hidden behind technical economic language. Accepted because it's complicated and confusing. Same trick. Different vocabulary to here's what the economics textbooks always seem to miss. War bonds were never really about raising money. The government can always create money when it needs to. Bonds were about political economy, creating stakeholders, managing mass psychology, preventing inflation spirals, distributing costs broadly, making war feel participatory instead of distant, making financial loss feel patriotic instead of painful. The financial mechanism was always secondary. The social mechanism was what really mattered. When 75,000 4-minute men are knocking on doors every single day, when Disney is making propaganda cartoons, when schools are competing in bond drives, when employers are pressuring workers, when celebrities are performing on television, when your neighbor's window has a flag in it and yours doesn't, buying that bond becomes inevitable. The actual return on investment becomes irrelevant. You're not making a financial decision at that point. You're making a social compliance decision. And the government understood that perfectly. They always understood it. That's exactly why these campaigns worked so well. That's why they managed to sell hundreds of billions in bonds despite negative real returns. That's why people bought them even when their fathers had lost money on Liberty bonds the generation before. Because the pressure wasn't financial in nature, it was social. And social pressure turns out to be a lot more powerful than arithmetic. Oh, now you're sitting here with all this information. You've basically got three options for what to do with it. First, you can decide that historical war bonds were a unique situation. Desperate times required desperate measures. Legitimate emergency, no longer relevant to today. Second, you can start noticing the same pattern repeating itself in modern monetary policy with different mechanisms, but producing identical outcomes. Third, you can ask yourself the really uncomfortable question, which is this: if they did all this during wars that everyone generally agreed were necessary, what exactly are they doing during crises that are less clear cut, less existential, less universally supported? The mechanism exists. The precedent is there. The institutional knowledge is still around. The question isn't whether governments can use inflation as a hidden tax. History proves they absolutely can and regularly do. The real question is when you'll notice it's happening to you right now, and whether noticing it actually changes anything. Because 75,000 4-minute men equipped with modern technology and social media is just called an advertising campaign these days. The bond drives never really ended. They just got rebranded, and you're still buying.